I've just been quietly advised that I will be moderating this session. Okay, so we are going to get started because we're already into 10 a.m. in 10 minutes. So I'm actually just going to turn this over to Renu, Mary, and Dale, who are from these three regions that I just previously noted. And again, they're going to talk about the provincial and territorial approaches being taken with the legalization and regulation of cannabis for non-medicinal purposes, including opportunities for Indigenous engagement and participation in provincial and territorial frameworks. And what I would like to do is ensure that we do have opportunity for questions and comments. Because we're working with a bit of a time frame, maybe I'll just ask you to just accommodate a little bit, truncate your discussions, and basically just give the general bullet points of your various regions and approaches and key points, and we'll actually engage our participants. So I'll turn it over to the gentleman on the left.
So it's always good to be voluntold to do stuff. My name is Dale Tesarowski, and I'm a lawyer, and please don't hold that against me. Are there other lawyers here? Because if there are, I'll speak slower. The last time I was in this building, I was speaking to a bunch of CPAs, and it's a real opportunity for a lawyer to make an accountant joke, but I'm not going to take advantage of that either. I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak today about Saskatchewan's approaches towards legalization and regulation of cannabis, including opportunities for Indigenous engagement and participation in provincial and territorial frameworks. I have a lot to say about the first part, well, maybe not so much now, but sadly not so much about the second and the third parts of that. We have not done a very good job of engaging with our Indigenous communities, but we do hope to do better. We want to learn from our experiences and move forward as well as we can. In Saskatchewan, we started by doing a public survey, and we had over 36,000 responses to our survey. It was the largest survey the Saskatchewan government had ever experienced, and we learned a lot from that. And we based largely our Saskatchewan framework on the results of that consultation. We also sent some targeted surveys to differing stakeholders, including Indigenous communities, and received a number of responses from that process as well. Saskatchewan has adopted most of the federal rules with respect to possession limits and cultivation at home. We did go to 19 as the minimum age to match our drinking age. We prohibited cannabis consumption in public unless it was for medical purposes, and introduced a number of regulations and a statute to guide our work forward. We currently have 20 retail stores in operation in Saskatchewan. We had planned on having 51 within 1 year of legalization, and we are moving towards that goal. What has sort of held things up has been really two parts. One is that because we were sort of rushed into legalization, a lot of our municipalities weren't able to sort of develop the plans that they wanted in terms of zoning and land use requirements, and that held up some of our retailers from finalizing their permit process. And the other was really the problems that have come out about the supply of cannabis and how little of it there is to go around, at least at the retail level. And we found that a number of retailers have simply not wanted to open shop until they were sure that they could stay open for the hours that they wanted to stay open and to have a suitable amount of product over a broad range of types of products to be able to move forward. We actually had a lottery in Saskatchewan to determine who would get our 51 permits. And of those, I think we received some 1,500 applications for the 51 retail opportunities. We limited our retail opportunities to communities of 2,500 or more. And the reason for that was we wanted to start small and get it right, but also to ensure that we could have a geographic spread of retail stores across the province, so that there wasn't one area that wasn't getting any opportunity to purchase cannabis, and also to the lottery was to have a fair process. And we didn't want to get into the weighing of this application versus that application. So through the lottery process, a number of our successful applicants have partnered with the Indigenous communities to better serve their populations. We also have 4 wholesalers who have received permits, and 31 of the licensed producers across Canada have registered to sell cannabis in Saskatchewan. We have a completely private model in Saskatchewan in that government isn't involved in either the retail, the wholesale, or the distribution of cannabis. We've left that all up to the private market. And in doing that, we've been able to sort of eliminate some of the issues some other jurisdictions have experienced. 3 of our First Nations met the population requirement of 2,500. All 3 have declined to pursue their permit applications, at least at this time. We also, though, promised to revisit our retail plan 12 to 18 months after legalization. And it's this second wave that I think gives us a better chance to work with Indigenous communities and to move forward in that respect. He said to move along, so I'm moving along. I'm going to take off my Saskatchewan hat for a bit, and this is where you stop taking notes and you stop recording, because I'm going to say some stuff that comes from me and not from my government. The issues that we're talking about are pertinent to Indigenous communities and governments, as pertinent as they are to non-Indigenous communities and governments. A wise chief recently told me that we're all treaty people. And I took from that we're all in this together. We potentially have much to gain, and our challenge is how to take advantage of this situation. I don't like to talk about sovereignty too much. It's very complicated, it's an emotional concept, and one that is both time and resource intensive. I prefer a more practical discussion. How can we get from here to there is an expedient way as possible while being respectful of each other's positions. We may be asked to agree to do or to say things that may not ultimately address weightier issues, essentially holding our collective noses a bit just to get the job done. No one wants a protracted court case either. No one wants years of negotiations. Is there a way to move forward now? I know there is, only because of my belief that there has to be. Things as simple as where we bank our potential profits will probably dictate a more practical, more timely resolution of these issues. If I were asked the question, if cannabis products are tested and meet current Health Canada standards, will there be any other federal or provincial barriers to full commercial participation? I would have to answer honestly, as any lawyer would do, and say, I hope not. But we must have meaningful discussions to address these potential barriers. There is so much that we do agree upon. We must focus on these areas and then tackle the larger issues. Safe supply and protected communities are 2 of the main things that I think we all agree upon. Protecting our youth is certainly part of that. Some other issues are trickier. Let's talk about one of those tricky issues. Legal supply is the linchpin to all of this. But to discuss it's like watching my dog chase its tail. There's a whole lot going on, but it doesn't seem to be getting anywhere. The federal government has said that it's responsible for cannabis production and that it's for provinces and territories to regulate cannabis retailing. A licensed producer cannot sell to an unpermitted or provincially authorized retailer, nor can a permitted retailer sell product obtained from an unlicensed producer. That's the circle. To extend my analogy further, my dog is chasing its tail on a very dusty road. There's a lot of stuff being kicked up to interfere in this process. And to further complicate things, we know, for example, that there have been some issues with the quality of lawfully grown and supplied cannabis. That there's an amount issue is part of this dust on my road. The legal supply chain is not perfect. We also know that the federal government chose not to retain retail jurisdiction for First Nations. They gave that to provinces and territories. So how do we sort all this out? We talk. We have a situation in one of our First Nations that began just shortly before the Cannabis Conference in November in Calgary. We've been talking with this First Nation for 3 months. I don't have the chief's permission to talk about the specifics, but what we did was we went back to the principles we agree upon. We want safe product, both in terms of how it's grown, but also by whom it's grown. If we're satisfied that it's good product and it hasn't been tainted, either chemically or otherwise, or by organized crime. If we're satisfied, then why don't we incorporate a little bit of flexibility into the mix? Let's either find a way to make it easier for producers to get licensed or to get our own production licenses. Or maybe find a process where the First Nation can license its own producers. That's where compromise has to be found. Maybe there's enough criteria that a First Nation can create that will satisfy federal concerns about product safety and sourcing to enable some form of co-licensing. Maybe federal indigenous discussions lead to some kind of joint control over the retailing of cannabis on First Nations. There's a lot to talk about. To return to my practicality argument, let's get these discussions going faster and in a time frame that sees long-term gains realized so that maximum benefits can be obtained for everyone. I think I've used up enough of your patience. I look forward to any questions you may have. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Okay, thank you, Dale. I heard some really good things in there, and it sounds to me like from a intergovernmental approach as it pertains to Canada working with the provinces and territories on this issue, there certainly are discussions around flexibility, and I like what I'm hearing coming out of Saskatchewan and, you know, Chief Capo in the community that has identified themselves as asserting a certain position and the constructive dialogue that's happening. Obviously, it's come a long way since November, and I think that's a good sign. So again, thank you for those comments. What we're going to do is we're going to turn it over to Mary, and then we're going to hear from Renu after that. And they're mic'd up, so they'll be able to sit down. They have presentations. Again, those presentations will be made available. They will be doing a bit of an abbreviated presentation. Be much. Yeah, maybe you need to turn your... Okay, we've got somebody mic'd up.
Okay, is it?
Okay,
it sounds like it's on now.
Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me and for the opportunity to talk a little bit today about BC's legislative framework. I will focus primarily on retail, and I may not stop on all of these slides, just given the time constraints. So my name is Mary Shaw. I'm the Executive Director of the BC Cannabis Legalization and Regulation Secretariat. I came to the cannabis field in about mid-2017. So soon after the federal government introduced its legislation, BC established a secretariat to lead the development of the cannabis policy work for BC. And here's where we started. So with these 5 provincial priorities that align quite well with the federal government's priorities. So priority on public health and safety, on protecting children and youth, reducing crime in the illegal market, addressing cannabis-affected driving, and supporting economic development. And we ended up here. In the fall of 2017, we did significant engagement with the public, with stakeholders, and with First Nations. With respect to our public engagement, we had nearly 50,000 responses to our online survey. And then we heard from, we had written submissions from about 120 organizations, including First Nations. We had lots of meetings with individual First Nations. We had regional teleconferences. We presented to the BC AFN, to the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, as well as the First Nations Summit. And we also initiated with the First Nations Leadership Council a working group to discuss issues related to cannabis legalization. And that group continues to meet regularly. So where we ended up is with the Cannabis Control and Licensing Act, the Cannabis Distribution Act, and some amendments to the Motor Vehicle Act, which I won't speak much about. The first 2 statutes, the titles actually mirror our liquor statutes. So we have a Liquor Control and Licensing Act and a Liquor Distribution Act. And we did draw quite heavily from that liquor framework. So the Cannabis Control and Licensing Act is the big statute. That's the one that deals with minimum age for BC, with possession limits, with places where you can use cannabis, and with some additional rules for home cultivation. And it sets out the retail framework for private retail. The Distribution Act sets up Liquor Distribution Act as the provincial distributor for cannabis and the public retailer. So for retail and distribution, BC has a mixed model. It is mixed public and private retail, which is similar to our liquor model. So British Columbians are very familiar with the fact that you can go to a public BC liquor store or you can go to a private liquor store to buy your wine or beer liquor. And so we have a similar system for cannabis. Like I said, the distribution is done by Liquor Distribution Branch. And the Liquor and Cannabis Regulation Branch is the body that licenses the private non-medical cannabis retail stores. So they have somewhere in the range of 400 applications right now, and they are working through those applications. They've issued 12 licenses. BC chose to have quite a significant role for indigenous nations and for local governments in the retail process. And so the decision that BC took was to not open a public cannabis store or issue a license for a private store without the support of that community. So Indigenous nations can have a couple of roles in the BC retail scheme, and that can be sort of as a government or as a retailer. So with respect to, from the perspective of an Indigenous nation as a government, Liquor and Cannabis Regulation Branch receives the applications, for cannabis retail stores. And where that store is located on reserve or treaty settlement land, they will forward the application to the relevant Indigenous nation. Liquor and Cannabis Regulation Branch continues to work on the aspects of the application that they are responsible for. So that includes the background checks and the financial integrity checks. And simultaneously, the Indigenous nation works on what its recommendation is going to be. If at any time the Indigenous nation decides not to consider the application, perhaps because they don't want cannabis retail stores on their land, or if it goes through its process and then doesn't support that application, the process ends and a license will not be issued. So the other way that Indigenous nations have a role in BC is as a retailer themselves. So an Indigenous nation can apply for a cannabis retail store license in its own name without being incorporated as a business. But there are lots of differences between various Indigenous nations. So there's no real one-size-fits-all for that retail licensing process. And so LCRB has a dedicated team that works with Indigenous nations that are interested in being licensed cannabis retailers. And they work with those communities and take into consideration their unique circumstances. So I've also got contact information up here for Josh Huska. He's the lead of that team, and that's who folks can contact for any information that they need around that process in BC. And so this is the last slide. I started out with the 5 provincial objectives, one of which was supporting economic development. What we would like to see in BC is a sustainable cannabis industry that generates jobs and economic growth throughout the province, and including in Indigenous communities. Like Dale, I think it's clear that because we had such constrained timelines for legalization, the province needed to enact legislation in the spring of 2018 to be ready for the federal legalization date. And we would have liked to do more engagement and consultation. But recognizing that we did have a fairly truncated time to develop that legislation, we included in our legislation an authority for the province to enter into agreements with Indigenous nations with respect to cannabis. So those agreements can vary the requirements of the Act. So we continue to have those conversations with individual First Nations. As I mentioned, we also have a working group with the BC First Nations Leadership Council, and economic development related to cannabis has been a priority for discussion at that table. And we have had Indigenous nations, both at that table and elsewhere, communicate a range of ideas for how the province could support cannabis-related economic benefits flowing to First Nations. And so we continue to have those conversations. And then, of course, in government, we work to consider the proposals that we've received to date. I think I will end it there.
Okay. Thank you, Mary. And again, these presentations will be available. We are now going to turn it over to Renu, the Ontario representative. And again, last but not least, this is the Ontario region, and there are a number of similar issues and also some very distinct issues and challenges, again, that we're faced with here in the Ontario region. And Renu's been on this file, I think, right from the beginning. And again, we'll turn it over to Renu. Thank you.
Okay, let me see if I'm set up here. Oh, maybe not. Oh yeah, here we are. So thank you very much for inviting me as a door, and I've been involved, I think, about as long as Mary has been on this file, and I remember our earlier meetings when Yasser Naqvi was still the Attorney General, and meeting with you as Ontario Regional Chief, so appreciate the ongoing relationship and the outreach and being able to be here today. So in the interest of time, and given that you will have this presentation, I'm just going to highlight a few key pieces about Ontario's framework, which some of you may be very familiar with. So apologies if you've seen some of this presentation before, because recognizing it'll be new for some folks. There are common themes, I would say, that I want to pick up on that both Mary and Dale have talked about. I should also say that we do watch and learn from each other. In terms of best practices, particularly with respect to engagement. And we are, having started more slowly than I think we would have wanted to with respect to engagement, we are starting to pick up steam and really hoping that some of the conversations we've been having over the past year will result in some real movement in terms of First Nations economic access to economic development, but also the ability to look at licensing opportunities and solutions that work best in very community-specific ways. So just a brief review of Ontario's legislative framework. We have two pieces of legislation. One is the Cannabis Control Act 2017 that outlines some of the key restrictions related to the sale, distribution, purchase, possession, and transportation, cultivation, and consumption of cannabis. And then we also have the Cannabis License Act, which is more specifically relates to the retailing of the retail system, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Just a reminder, though, that in Ontario we do have a bit of a mixed system, and we've had two systems because we had an election and we had a government that came in and wanted to have a more free market approach to cannabis legalization to involve the private sector in terms of bricks and mortar storefront. So we're in the process of implementing that system. I'll talk a little bit more about what the changes might mean, but as Isidore said, that we moved from a public store model to this new model, and that's involved a bit more consultation and engagement to help everyone understand what that new system looks like. I would say just one of the other big changes in terms of the new framework is the smoking and vaping of cannabis now aligns with Smoke Free Ontario Act. So it's a bit less restrictive in terms of consumption and places of use rules. And again, some of the key features of the Act, you must be 19 in Ontario to do many of these cannabis-related activities. Okay, so I just want to talk a little bit about regulating private retail and the new Cannabis License Act, which it establishes the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario as the independent provincial regulator that's overseeing the system. And it also establishes some due diligence requirements and specific eligibility criteria for licenses, including financial responsibility and some other principles that are very familiar to those who have worked with the Alcohol and Gaming Commission on some of the other matters that it governs. It also has, as very similar to objectives as what Mary outlined with respect to ensuring that there is that we're protecting youth and also combating the illicit market at the same time. In terms of some specific regulatory provisions in the regulation, stores must be standalone only, so can't be part of another facility, and they're age restricted in terms of being only open to those who are 19 or over. There's a minimum distance requirement of 150 meters between cannabis retail stores and most schools, and every individual who applies for a license is evaluated on a case-by-case basis. I would say that having a previous conviction around possession or even trafficking may not be a barrier to getting a license. Every application is evaluated individually. And finally, there are requirements that licensed retailer display an Ontario seal so that consumers know that they're accessing legal cannabis. So, as was mentioned, and as is the longer term objective, Ontario's approach to legalization is to openly license stores and to set very minimum restrictions in terms of, other than the ones that I've outlined, around where these stores can be located. There is a process around public notice that involves the Alcohol and Gaming Commission around sensitive uses, but the philosophy behind this is having access to legal cannabis will displace the illicit market. The current challenge we have right now is with respect to supply and supply expectations, fill rates, and there are certainly a number of issues given that this is a new industry with respect to supply chain as well. So as a result, the Ontario government made a very temporary decision to limit the number of licenses it would be allocating in the short term to 25, with the hope that there'd be 25 stores open on April 1st. So the allocation of the 25 licenses was geographically based and population based. And given the size of Ontario, it's not a very big number, and that's recognized, and the intent is to open up the market as soon as possible once we have a sense of how the supply situation is shaping up. The lottery process itself was overseen by a third-party monitor to ensure fairness. There are lots of rules in Ontario around affiliation that are deliberately set to ensure that small and medium-sized businesses and single proprietors have access to the market and to legal storefront. So not an ideal situation in terms of that longer-term objective of an open and freer market, but we do believe this is temporary, and we are working very closely in the Ontario Cannabis Store as the wholesalers, working very closely with producers and to understand some of those supply chain issues and to be able to move more quickly to an open market as soon as we can have that level of certainty. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the First Nations specific provisions in Ontario's legislation. So with respect to on-reserve delivery, the Ontario Cannabis Store will not deliver to an address in a community that has requested that has been through a band council resolution that has requested that delivery not take place. And there are a number of communities that have specifically asked the Ontario Cannabis Store and our ministry not to allow that delivery. So that provision has been enacted in some cases. With respect to opt-outs and approvals, under the temporary lottery system, as I mentioned, no licenses will be issued to operators who wish to operate a store on reserved land. And this, I would say, also allows us time for further engagement where there are specifically situations where we know that communities are interested in developing their own licensing systems or co-licensing, as Dale has mentioned. With respect to, this does not preclude, in terms of the lottery system, did not preclude anyone from applying for a license. It just really was respect to where those stores might be located. Where communities want to opt out of retail altogether, they can do that by a band council resolution. If a community does not want to opt out of retail, chief and council approval will be required, again by a BCR, before the Alcohol and Gaming Commission authorizes a retail license. And the other key provision I wanted to highlight is that the Attorney General is able to enter into an agreement with First Nation communities on a wide scope of legislative components, including matters related to age, enforcement tools, etc. And agreements with First Nations chief and councils on the regulation of retail stores, the licensing or authorizations of persons to operate of in the stores, or the enforcement of the act and regulation in a community are all considerations that this enabling provision allows. Now, do recognize that some communities and that there are certainly recognize perspectives on jurisdiction. I think what these legislative provisions allow us to do is open a door to dialogue to really understand how specific communities want to regulate in this space, and to see what we can do in working with our federal partners to help facilitate a situation where we can understand that we all have these broader public policy objectives, as Dale outlined in his comments as well, and that we want to work to kind of harmonize where we can, and where we recognize that where there are mechanisms in place to fundamentally address those concerns of Health Canada, we can work together to find solutions that work for all of us. So just wanted to briefly talk about how engagement has gone to date. As I mentioned, started slowly. We're picking up a bit of steam, and really since the fall of 2017, we have worked first with provincial organizations and political territorial organizations, and individually with communities to try to understand what their needs are. Initially, it was really around community engagements and the resources to be able to do that, and we've been able to provide some financial resources to that end. Our team, a very small but active team, has been involved in about 60 different events with communities since 2017. We have learned much from that process, and I would say that there are very broad interests with respect to cannabis legalization in Ontario, and while some communities are really interested in permitting cannabis within community subject to federal and provincial regulations, some communities are already moving forward with their own approaches and their own regulations and legislation with respect to cannabis legalization. We also learned from the work we've done in the past with tobacco that an enforcement-only based approach with First Nations is not necessarily productive. And we want to work with First Nations communities to understand what their enforcement needs and perspectives are, what their public education and health needs are, where there are gaps that we can help with, and where we can work together with our federal counterparts at the table to bring sort of meaningful information to help communities make their own decisions about how they want to move forward. So I think, we're happy to be at the table. We're happy to participate in any way that is meaningful to help reach these objectives. This is going to be an ongoing process for years, and we are also looking forward to opportunities that will be created by a more open market, which we hope will stabilize in the near future. I won't spend a lot more time on my presentation. There's a lot more information here on training and some other pieces related to public education, and specifically a youth diversion program, which is really aimed at getting young people out of away from the courts and into education-focused programs. So, using a ticketable offense as a lever, getting kids to do an online program. The program that was launched recently is just the beginning. We want to work with Indigenous communities to develop community-driven programs that are youth-focused. So we want to talk to you more about that as well. And I think I will leave it at there for now, and happy to take questions, comments.
Great, thank you. I will open this up to the floor for questions, comments. Again, we have BC, Saskatchewan, and Ontario. A lot of really good things that were said here, clarifies a number of things. Again, what's really of interest to me, just so I get my comment in here, is the intergovernmental landscape focus where it pertains to the crossover of federal enabling legislation and how that's interpreted on the ground, and the entrepreneurs and retail, and there's a lot of things to be discussed here. I'm glad to hear that there's a willingness right across the board to acknowledge community decision-making processes. And again, just a couple of things that I wanted to highlight. We'll go to mic number 2, please.
Good morning. My name is Megan Goulet from Nipissing First Nation, but I'm here on behalf of the Anishinaabe Nation. So my question is for Ontario. What consideration was taken in regards to including or consulting First Nation communities when Ontario put the restriction on retail stores being located in municipalities greater than 50,000 in population? Based on my understanding, First Nation population in some of our communities doesn't go that high. So what consideration was taken when you made that restriction, which excluded all our First Nation communities in Ontario?
Sure.
And just a point of clarification, there are no First Nations even in Canada that have a 50,000 population base. So.
Sure, and I would say it's, the first to acknowledge it's not an ideal situation, but there are a couple of things, and I think, I guess, similar to some other jurisdictions' experience, given that there were only 25 stores in this first tranche, there was an effort to try to get at the largest population centers geographically based on census data from StatsCan, which also excluded a lot of large municipalities and other areas. I would say that some of the considerations from a First Nations perspective was that there were already active discussions with some communities who weren't really looking for licensing opportunities within the context of the Alcohol and Gaming Commission licensing context. So what we were hearing was a real interest in developing community-specific licensing systems. So that being said, we know that there are some First Nation communities within Ontario who want to leverage the alcohol and gaming system in terms of licensing. And I would say with those communities, we are having an active dialogue. So this current state of Ontario's licensing system does not necessarily reflect the conversations we're having at the community level to get ready for a more open market. And I would say that while the current situation is not ideal for anyone, and certainly not from a government perspective either, that doesn't stop us from starting to have conversations with communities who are ready and willing to work within the context of the Ontario licensing system. And there are a couple of communities that we're actively engaged with in that regard right now.
Okay, thank you. And the comment takeaway for me there was the current state of Ontario's licensing regime does not reflect the current dialogue that's happening with First Nations in Ontario. So there's, even though the legislation says one thing, there's that open door of discussion and dialogue with a number of First Nations in Ontario, correct?
Yeah, and so I would say if your community has a specific interest, please come and talk to myself or my colleague Jesse Todres, who's sitting at the table there, and we're happy to provide you with our contact information. And if we haven't engaged with your community to date, we'll be happy to have a discussion offline.
Okay, thank you. Mic number 2.
Hi, my name is Michael. I'm here on behalf of Dicentra Cannabis Consulting. This is directed towards Ontario. So you guys, everyone in government seems to preach the same thing: public health and safety, not allowing for our children to have access. So let me ask you this. I understand the whole premise behind the expression of interest lottery and limiting it to 25 stores. But when you take into consideration the population of Saskatchewan is just over 1 million people, and they issued 51 licenses. The population of Toronto itself is over 2 million people, and you're dedicating 5 locations in the entire city of Toronto, and 25 across the province with a population of 14 million people. How do you think that that's going to have an impact on access to our to people who live in the province of Ontario, considering there's very limited resources already available? And on top of that, what is the provincial government's intention moving forward once the expression of interest lottery period ends in December of this year?
So that's about 4 or 5 questions, and I'll try to do my best
Sorry.
to answer all of them. And I think I may have with some of my, my remarks, but I guess Ontario, which was early to the game and then late to the game, given the transition in government, took a look at what was happening across the country in terms of fill rates and the ability of retailers to access supply, and did not want to set up a system where people are investing a lot of money in getting a license, in getting a store location, and then not being able to have predictable supply. So the situation as it currently stands and this is something we're monitoring very closely and working through the Ontario Cannabis Store with licensed producers, with small and large producers. There was a product call recently to try to stabilize that access. As I mentioned, the original intent and the longer-term objective of the Ontario government is an open system, recognizing that, to your point, the only way to displace an established illicit market is to have enough consumer choice around licit cannabis. So I would say, I think we all have the same long-term objective in terms of, you know, having a system of retail that is safe, that prohibits youth access, and does displace that illicit market. I think it's just going to take us a little time to get there, but to assure you that we're working really hard to get to that place. We just need to work with our system partners and ensure they have the capacity to get there with us.
So would you say that by April 1st of this year that all 25 locations would be ready to go? Because that's a pretty tight deadline based on the lottery. And just the question I really want answered is, what happens once the regulations are amended in December of this year in the province of Ontario?
Look, so using my crystal ball, I will say that it's a challenging timeline. Ideally we'll have 25 stores by April 1st. Maybe that will flow a little bit into April, May, depending on the process that's underway in terms of going through those retail operator licenses. You'll note that there's some, even in the byword market, there's some retail store authorizations that are popping up. It's going to be an iterative process. That regulation expires in December. That's not to say that if we get a clear signal sooner, we can introduce something well ahead of that to expand the market and opportunities. So I would say this is something that we're working on a weekly basis, and as soon as we can get to that point, I think that we're really quite interested in, I think as much as probably you are, as ensuring that we have more and a greater access to legal cannabis for consumers. And we also have the online system, right? So that's as a default for now, and that is provincial unless there's been specific express desire by a First Nation community not to have delivery in community.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Mic number 2.
Hi, my name is Jill Bennington. I'm here representing Tobic First Nation, Tribal Relief. I know that nobody up there is from New Brunswick, but I was hearing the question of when you said that the stores were being based on the population of roughly 50,000. When a store was opened in Perth, and the combined population of Tobic First Nation in Perth is roughly 3,000 people. So if the stores were being based by population of 50,000, is that what you said? Every province was different? Every province.
Saskatchewan. We were 2,500
Thank you.
people.
See, again, this is a really good question, and even though this is not pertaining to any of the presenters from the various regions up here, it just really signals that there's such an inconsistency for First Nations on these policy issues right across the country. And this is one of the challenges when First Nations are discussing this, and when we're trying to wrap our heads around, look, how do various regions address the issues and aspirations of cannabis retailers and entrepreneurs in that specific region on First Nation lands. There is a real confusing disconnect, and I think it has a lot to do, and if you noticed, each one of these presenters said the same thing. This legislation came fast and hard, and that really posed an issue and challenge in our communities, and for our chief and councils, it has created a real challenge in that you got to get to the community. You recognize the community decision-making process. That's not always easy when the government goes ahead and rams something through like this. And then we're left with that challenge. So I want to note that. And again, it's a really good question to show the diversity of the issues across the country. And I think this panel is really, in an important way, identifying that. Mic number 1, please.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Toronto from the Cody First Nation in Saskatchewan. My question is for Dale. You talked about consultation, and as a leader in my community in the last 2.5 years, I don't recall any of this. You talk about the population of 2,500, the 3 First Nations that were granted the lottery licenses to open retail stores on their First Nations. Is that total? Is that on reserve, or is that total band membership? How was it granted? I have a few questions. That was one. The other was, just wait. We also have the gas and tobacco rebate program in Saskatchewan. How does the cannabis being sold on reserves, is that going to be included in our rebate program?
Okay, to answer the first question, it was based on the size of the community. And I think it was LaRange, Onion Lake. I'm sorry, I can't remember the third one, but...
Peter Ballantyne?
Yes, thank you. And they decided not to proceed at this time. That doesn't mean that we gave their 3 permits to somebody else or to other communities. We kept them there so that they could begin the process if they wanted to in their communities. The gas and the tobacco sharing revenue agreements is a model that we think we can apply in the cannabis context, and we're working with the First Nation to try and make it work in some way. The Indian gaming regulation process is something else that we're using as a potential model for the regulation of cannabis on First Nations.
Have you looked at the tribal council area-wise in the population? Have you used that as a, I guess, as a level of...
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, we have, and we are actively considering that as well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I want to ask you to give these presenters a big round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. And as noted, this is a really important panel, and it just gives an indication, as I said, the diversity of issues and challenges across the country, and the crossover from Bill C-45, the enabling legislation, to the devolution of retail to the provinces and territories. It's a real issue for our communities because it is complex. We're definitely not confined in our minds and in our hearts as First Nation communities. Yes, we have First Nation land base, but we certainly, in terms of Algonquins, as an example, are basically saying we have access to our entire traditional unsurrendered territory. And that being said, this does, and again, I just want to touch on your point that you made, Dale, about the sovereignty issue is complex, and it's an emotional discussion, and we want to try to move from point A to point B quickly. That's not possible because the basis of our existence, the basis of our assertions are sovereignty based. And again, we have to find a common ground on those discussions. And I think that the willingness to find those solutions and find those avenues for where flexibility can be found or where we can recognize First Nation jurisdiction, it's a huge step forward, and I think I'm hearing that on the panel. So let's give them a final round of applause, and we'll move on to our next session. Thank you.